Some breaking news this morning on the search for a coronavirus vaccine. The results of one small study on humans are now in, and they appear to be encouraging.
The drug maker Inovio jumping as much as 16% at its highs today. Why, you ask? Well, the company released preliminary data from an incomplete phase 1 trial that showed promising results for its experimental coronavirus vaccine. The research was done on mice.
Human trials in Europe of a coronavirus vaccine has begun in Oxford in what is a highly significant moment. This afternoon, 2 volunteers, both scientists, were injected. They're the first of more than 800 adults aged between 18 and 55 who've been recruited for the study.
Scientists across the world are working around the clock to develop one, from China to the United States, Germany and Britain. New technologies are helping speed things up. More than 100 potential vaccines are in development. Some are already at an advanced stage and are being tested on volunteers.
There are also 2 promising developments this morning that we want to get to in the race to find a vaccine for the coronavirus. Charlie D'Agata has that part of the story.
2 front runners in the hunt for the vaccine, both reporting great
no
strides.
guarantee we will find something to beat this virus. But the idea that just because a lot of teams work on this, it's going to give somebody the breakthrough, that doesn't follow.
So as you can see, and as I'm sure you've heard, there have been a lot of conflicting reports lately about the coronavirus vaccine. So for my talk, I decided to go over how vaccine development works and what it means for you and all of us in the age of coronavirus. First, it's important to know exactly what is a vaccine. A vaccine is a type of medicine that forces your immune system to make antibodies. Antibodies are proteins that your immune system produces when you come into contact with viruses or bacteria. And antibodies protect you from getting reinfected with that same virus or bacteria because they tag the virus or bacteria and tell your immune system to destroy it. Normally, you need to have the sickness that's caused by the live virus or bacteria to get those antibodies and to get the eventual immunity from the sickness. But the goal of a vaccination is to help you get those antibodies without having the sickness. Vaccines, obviously, they have saved countless lives by preventing the infections in the first place. And vaccines curb rampant infections because people who get a vaccine can't be infected, and so they can't pass the infection on to others. So vaccines are critical in breaking the chain of transmission of an infection. Vaccines are regulated in the United States by the U.S. Public Service Act of 1944, and that mandated that the federal government issue licenses for biological products, including vaccines. The Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, which is part of the FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, oversees vaccine safety and regulation in the United States. In the European Union, the European Medicines Agency supervises regulations of vaccines and other drugs within the European Economic Zone. And for developing countries who don't have as robust regulation systems for their drugs, the World Health Organization has a committee to make recommendations for biological products used internationally. Many smaller countries and many developing countries have adopted WHO standards. Vaccine development is a pretty lengthy process, and it starts with the idea, first do no harm. The side effect tolerance for vaccines is pretty low because people who are injected with vaccines are normally otherwise healthy. Vaccines are preventative. So vaccine development can cost hundreds of millions of dollars because it has to be both safe and effective. And it can take between 7 and 20 years. The human record for vaccine development is 4 years. So I just wanted to take you through the timeline of vaccine development. So this is just a quick timeline, and I'll walk through each phase later on. First comes the preclinical research exploratory stage, which takes 2 to 4 years. Then the preclinical stage and an FDA IND application. Those take 1 to 2 years. A phase 1 clinical study normally takes 1 to 2 years. Phase 2 normally takes 2 or more years. Phase 3 normally takes 3 to 4 years. Applying for a biologics license for the vaccine normally takes a year, and that's through the FDA. Production and distribution of the vaccine then takes 5 to 6 years. So that brings the typical vaccine development pipeline to 15 to 21 years. So let's start with the preclinical research phase. Researchers have to first learn about the virus or bacterium of interest before they develop a vaccine for it. There are multiple ways to develop a vaccine, and researchers need to choose one. The two ways are using a weakened live microbe and a non-live microbe, and we'll discuss those later on when we look at specific COVID-19 vaccines that are under development right now. This stage normally takes 2 to 4 years. After that comes the preclinical stage. In this stage, before clinical trials on humans can begin, animal models and cell cultures are used to ensure safety and efficacy. Researchers often freely perform animal challenge trials, which is when they vaccinate an animal and then purposefully infect it with the virus or bacterium in question in order to test the efficacy of the vaccine. As you can imagine, this is more difficult to do with humans because there are less human volunteers willing to undergo a challenge trial and be infected on purpose with a bad virus or a bad bacteria. And in response to the results of animal challenge trials and vaccinating animal models, researchers can modify the vaccine. This is a pretty common failure point for the vaccine because this is the first place where safety and efficacy are both really tested in the real world. This stage normally takes 1 to 2 years, and after this stage is over, a sponsor submits an investigational new drug application to the FDA, which takes about a month to process and get approved before human trials can begin. The sponsor is normally a private pharmaceutical company. Once the researchers are given the green light from the FDA, they can start the phase 1 clinical study, which is the first time that the vaccine is tested on humans. The phase 1 clinical study is a test in a very small group of people to help work out the right dosage and rule out major safety issues. About 100 people undergo the phase 1 clinical study. And the main goal here is safety, but there's also a focus here on watching for the immune response. In the phase 1 trial, challenge trials are rarely used because few researchers are willing to take that risk on their volunteers. And typically, trials in phase 1 are non-blinded, which means that there is a group receiving a placebo vaccine, but they know that they're receiving the placebo vaccine. Phase 1 normally takes 1 to 2 years. Next, researchers move on to a phase 2 clinical study. In this phase, researchers give the vaccine to 100 to 200 people, sometimes thousands of people if the virus or bacteria is very common. The researchers want to watch for more rare side effects and make sure that the vaccine gives a consistent immune response in generating antibodies. Subjects are normally not paid to take part in phase 2 because researchers want to avoid inappropriate inducement. They want subjects who actually want to volunteer for the study. And now the vaccine can be tested on the target demographic. So for example, if the vaccine is for children, in phase 1, the vaccine might have been tested on adults just for safety concerns. But now researchers will try to move towards testing the vaccine on children. Phase 2 studies are normally randomized, well-controlled, and double-blind. Double-blind means that there is a group receiving the placebo, but they don't know that they're receiving the placebo. Phase 2 normally takes 2 or more years. Now after phase 2, there's yet another phase, phase 3 on humans. The main purpose of phase 3 is to test for efficacy with thousands of healthy volunteers. Human challenge trials can help speed up phase 3. But in the absence of human challenge trials, researchers compare vaccinated and unvaccinated groups with blood tests. And also in phase 3, because there are thousands of healthy volunteers, researchers screen out final safety concerns. Just like phase 2, phase 3 is randomized, well-controlled, and double-blind. The side effect tolerance at this point is pretty low. Researchers don't want bad side effects because volunteers are healthy to begin with, and it's quite far on in the vaccine development process. And phase 3 takes 3 to 4 years. After all those phases, there's yet another phase, the biologics licensure application. And this is an application for permission from the FDA to distribute the drug. The approval process takes 1 year, and the FDA can continue to monitor the factory where the vaccines are produced even after they give the biologics license to the manufacturer. Now, after all that is done and the vaccine is licensed, manufacturers must distribute the vaccine to the general public. Vaccines are often complex to manufacture because manufacturers must prevent contamination of the vaccine in order to ensure its safety. Because of that, specialized factories must be built by manufacturers, and that can take 5 to 6 years, and then even longer to make enough doses of the vaccine and get it into people. Now, even after the vaccine goes out into the public, there's a stage called phase 4 trials, which is trials on the general public. And that allows for ongoing monitoring of adverse side effects of the vaccines. The CDC has developed a system called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS. And through that system, anyone in the general public, including doctors, can report unexpected side effects of vaccines. The CDC monitors this system and investigates every claim to determine whether it was caused by the vaccination or not. So now transitioning to COVID-19. COVID-19 is the name of the disease caused by the coronavirus. The name of the actual virus that causes the disease is SARS-CoV-2. It's 80% identical to SARS because it has the same spike proteins. Right now, there are over 100 vaccines in development for COVID-19 and almost 260 therapies in development. At the same time, after going through all those phases of vaccine development, it's pretty evident that producing a COVID-19 vaccine in 12 to 18 months is going to require a massive effort. But it is what Dr. Fauci has predicted. So is 12 to 18 months too optimistic? And the answer is possibly. We've never made a human coronavirus vaccine before, and the record time for us producing any vaccine is 4 years. Furthermore, less than 10% of vaccine candidates actually make it from phase 1 to final approval. Fast-tracking vaccine development is pretty dangerous because a top priority of vaccine development, and the reason it takes so long is because safety is top priority. Even after the vaccine is produced, billions of people have to be vaccinated. And then something else, a vaccine that we've been working on for 40 years, the HIV vaccine, hasn't materialized. This is a very helpful graphic from the New York Times showing that less than 10% of drug trials are ultimately approved. But there is a way that we could get there. We need to shorten and stagger the phases, and we need to combine the phases with each other. So first, we need to shorten exploratory preclinical research, and we want to rely on our knowledge from SARS and MERS, which are two coronaviruses that are very similar to SARS-CoV-2, and that appeared in the early 2000s. That would cut 2.5 years off of our vaccine development. Then, we need academic research to be done in parallel to the rest of the vaccine development. That could cut 2 years off our timeline. So that's where we are with that time cut off. So instead of having a vaccine by 2036, we would have it by 2032. Next, we could travel at pandemic speed through the vaccine process. And that's a term that was coined by the National Academy of the Sciences just last week, actually. Pandemic speed means starting subsequent steps in vaccine development before previous phases are complete. That would cut 2 years off of the vaccine development. One thing we really need to be careful about here is vaccine-induced enhancement, which is a side effect of a vaccine that actually makes the disease worse with the vaccine. So we definitely don't want that, even if we're going at pandemic speed. We need to begin phase 3 at the beginning of phase 2. That'll help us cut 1 year off the vaccine development. And we need emergency provisioning for the vaccine when we ultimately get it, so that we can vaccinate frontline workers first before the FDA takes a year to approve the vaccine. That could cut 1 year to 1.5 years off our time. So now we're down from 2036 to 2028. Still quite a while to get a vaccine. So next, we need to invest in quick production. Currently, factories for producing vaccines need to follow really strict guidelines, and they can take 5 or more years to build. We need to repurpose our current vaccine factories for the COVID vaccine, and we need to do that even before vaccines are approved. One example of how that's happening right now, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are investing in 7 factories for 7 different vaccines, none of which have been actually approved yet. But if we do that from now, that could actually save us 6.5 years in production time. Also, another way that we could cut down on production time, mRNA and DNA vaccines which are vaccines that contain instructions for our cells on how to produce antibodies instead of the antibodies themselves, are simpler to produce. And that could help us cut 1.5 years off of production time. One company that's working on an mRNA vaccine right now is Moderna. So if everything goes according to plan, we could have an emergency vaccine ready for frontline workers by February 2021. And notice that I said, if everything goes according to plan. At the same time, there's something to be said about having 100 different organizations working on a vaccine at the same time. And I just wanted to highlight a few of the most promising candidates. Moderna is in the lead for the mRNA vaccine. In March, they began phase 1 clinical trials, and on May 18th, they announced that their vaccine had led to neutralizing antibody production in 8 volunteers. Turns out that was incomplete data because phase 1 began with 45 volunteers, and the goal of the vaccine is to result in neutralizing antibody production in everyone who receives it, not just a fifth of the people who receive it. And Moderna's claim has to be taken with a grain of salt because they've never sold anything. They've never brought a product to market. Also, the NIH and Moderna are working together on this vaccine, and there was no NIH statement on this. Dr. Fauci did go on a few news channels, and he said that these results looked promising, but there was no official statement on this. No mRNA vaccines have ever actually been used, so this is another shot in the dark. And severe negative side effects were observed among the volunteers, including one volunteer had a very dangerously high fever, another volunteer had a dangerously high fever and also passed out. And as I said, the tolerance for side effects for these vaccines is pretty low because they're being injected into people who are otherwise healthy. So the first principle of vaccine development is do no harm. And this is Moderna's stock price after the announcement. So their executives made lots of money. They really cashed in after they released this news. So, you have to take their claims with a grain of salt because this is who they're speaking to. They're speaking to their shareholders at the end of the day. Another way to produce a vaccine is using inactivated virus or bacteria particles. In this case, inactivated SARS-CoV-2 particles. The company who's in the lead with this is a Chinese company called Sinovac. They've made impressive progress and they've seen a lot of neutralizing antibodies produced, but in primates, and they don't expect human phase 1 results until August. Western researchers, at the same time, are testing if the BCG tuberculosis vaccine will protect against COVID-19. It's a shot in the dark, but this vaccine has been shown to protect against numerous other respiratory diseases. Phase 3 trials are already underway for this because it's a previous vaccine and researchers already know that it's safe. It's difficult to make both of these types of vaccines, one with inactivated virus particles, one with inactivated bacteria particles, because they need huge quantities of chicken eggs, actually. So another type of vaccine is the DNA plasmid vaccine. It's similar to the mRNA vaccine, but in this case, the DNA actually integrates itself into the human genome, and it tells the cell how to produce antibodies for SARS-CoV-2. It's easier to produce, just like mRNA vaccines, and the lead with this is a company called Inovio. On May 20th, they announced promising results with animals. Phase 1 is going to be beginning in late June, and they are targeting phase 2 and 3 for later in the summer. This has also been described as another moonshot because we have never made a DNA vaccine, but if it works out, it could be pretty promising. Multiple companies are currently working on viral spike protein vaccines, and these use genes coding for the virus's spike protein, splice them into different viruses, and mass produce them in a vaccine. One example is Sanofi Pasteur, a French company repurposing its SARS effort for SARS-CoV-2. And the reason they can do that is because SARS and SARS-CoV-2 have the same viral spike protein. Same viral spike protein means same vaccine. The University of Pittsburgh is the furthest ahead in this type of development, but even they are estimating 1 more year on phase 1. So this type of vaccine is viewed as the slower, more traditional type of vaccine, while the others are quick, accelerated, and trying to get a vaccine done within a year. Medicago is a Canadian company that is producing virus-like particles within tobacco leaves. It's an easier way to mass-produce spike protein vaccines if these vaccines are the ones that we do end up using eventually. Medicago estimates that they can mass produce doses by 2023, which is still 3 years away. So that brings us to the final question. How is this pandemic going to end? I would say probably not with a vaccine, because there are too many moving parts and too much luck involved with getting a vaccine to market and vaccinating everyone within 12 to 18 months. We need to get our economy open and we need to go back to normal life as soon as possible. And frankly, rushing a vaccine to market is dangerous. It's unlikely. It's not practical right now. And vaccinating everyone is going to be a huge challenge, almost insurmountable, I'd say. It's important to note that big pharmaceutical companies like to drum up vaccine hype because vaccines are huge moneymakers. Just like we saw with the stock price of Moderna, which almost doubled after they made their vaccine announcement. But I think that the reality is that antivirals and therapeutics are significantly more important in improving COVID-19 outcomes right now. We also need to focus more on testing, which we are, and building a robust contact tracing system, which right now the United States isn't doing. And I think that if we're going to open, we need a good therapeutic, and we're working on that. There are over 260 therapeutics in development right now. We need testing, and we need contact tracing. I think that's the way to open. And sadly, I don't think that the way to open is a vaccine.